Today we will continue talking about the skin, the integumentary system, as part of our course in human anatomy and physiology. In the part 1 of this chapter, we talked about the epidermis, the epithelium of the skin, the keratinized stratified squamous epithelium that is the boundary on the surface of our body to the environment. And today we'll be talking about the dermis and hypodermis, the tissues underlying the epidermis. So the dermis is connective tissue proper, and it's got a lot of collagen fibers, so it's strong, but yet it's got some elastic fibers that make it flexible and recoil. It's got lots of different cell types in there. The resident cells are fibroblasts, which can secrete the collagen fibers and the ground substance of connective tissue proper. There's also some white blood cells in there, defensive cells, lest any injury to the epidermis or the allow bacteria to get into the body. So the collagen fibers, these heavy collagen fiber bundles, form a network that of the dermis that covers our sort of binds our body together on the surface. It also happens to be known as the hide of animals, or I couldn't resist throwing in there, it's denatured collagen from the hide of animals is what Jello is. We happen to have live close to the origin of Jello, the invention of Jello in Leroy, New York, down the street. The dermis contains a lot of nerve endings to produce sensation, a lot of blood vessels that have to do with temperature regulation and lymphatic vessels. There's appendages of the skin, so we'll be talking about appendages of the skin like hair follicles, glands, nails, and then but the dermis itself is made up of two primary layers: the papillary dermis and the reticular dermis. So here's a micrograph showing thick skin. The epidermis is here in green with all the layers of the stratum corneum, the keratinized layers, the dead cell layers that actually provide the barrier function of skin and the mechanical resistance to abrasion. But as with all epithelia, underlying the epidermis is areolar connective tissue. So the papillary dermis is areolar connective tissue, and it contains all the blood vessels that feed the epidermis. Epithelia are avascular, so there's a lot of capillaries out here and white blood cells in case any bacteria manage to penetrate through the epidermis and so forth. The reticular dermis, the orange color, those are collagen fiber bundles, and you can see how coarse they are down here in the reticular dermis. Dense, irregular connective tissue. Much heavier, stronger tissue than the loose weave of areolar tissue. So that's why you see those sort of angry-looking crisscrossing fibers. It makes it extremely strong. So again, this is the primary mechanical strength of the skin, is the reticular dermis. And in fact, in the context of the origin of this micrograph, the reticular dermis would be much, much thicker than all these parts that we see in the upper part of this micrograph. We just kind of cut it off there. This cartoon is nice because, as we've seen earlier, it exemplifies all the structures that we'd like to review in the skin, just somewhat out of proportion to one another size-wise. But anyway, it shows us where the papillary dermis is, the areolar tissue, the reticular dermis, the dense irregular connective tissue, and then underlying that is the hypodermis, which is made of adipose tissue and some more areolar connective tissue, some so-called fascia. You can see there's a lot of blood vessels in the skin, a lot of capillaries and so forth in the areolar tissue to feed the epidermis with nutrients and oxygen, but there's a lot of looping, redundant, essentially, blood vessels in the dermis that allow us to bring a lot of blood to the surface of the body for the purpose of dissipating heat. So there's a lot of vessels in here that, when they dilate, can bring a lot of hot blood from the deeper parts of the body out to the surface to create a heat gradient, by which we can lose some more heat from the body more quickly. You see a lot of nerve endings in here. Sensation is largely a result of structures in the dermis. You see some free nerve endings here, some Pacinian corpuscles, as we mentioned before at the beginning of the chapter here, some hair follicle receptors, dendrites of neurons that are wrapped right around the follicle of the hair bulb, I should say, of the hair follicle, which the slightest movement of a hair will trigger a sensory response in those neurons. So the papillary dermis. It's called that because if you look at the boundary between the papillary dermis and the epidermis, it's undulating. It looks wavy. It looks like there's little finger-like projections sticking up papilla. So the dermopapilla are these little sticking up parts of the dermis into the epidermis. Again, it's full of lots of microvessels to feed the epidermis, lots of collagen fibers and elastic fibers, but loosely woven. There's some space in there for white blood cells to wander through there all the time. As we said, there's a lot of extra blood vessels in there. There's nerve endings, various types of touch receptors. Particularly, a very sensitive type of touch receptor are called Meissner's corpuscles, and they're found in hairless skin, particularly on the nipples and external genitalia, for example. But we also talked about Merkel cells in the basal layer of the epidermis in conjunction with some dendrites in the dermis forming a sensitive touch receptor as well. And the Pacinian corpuscles are more sensors of pressure and vibration deep in the dermis. The loose or the free nerve endings, like the ones we see here in this cartoon, represent typically pain receptors, temperature sensors, either hot or cold, temperature sensors that record changes in temperature predominantly, itch receptors. So those are the type of sensations that would arise from activation of these free nerve endings. In thick skin, not only are there dermal papilla, but there are deeper folds of the dermis and epidermis, and they give rise to patterns of folds on the surface of the skin, so-called friction ridges, which are thought to be important for our ability to grip things that we hang on to and try to manipulate. Let's take a look at some friction ridges. Here's a micrograph showing this sort of the deep undulations of the boundary between the epidermis and the dermis in thick skin, forming these mountainous friction ridges. And here's a picture, an electron micrograph of the surface of skin, showing the familiar pattern of the so-called fingerprints friction ridges. You can see that the sweat glands, exocrine glands that release their product through ducts onto the surface, open right on the peaks of these friction ridges. Really cool. The reticular dermis is the main or major mechanical strength for the skin. It makes up the majority of the skin thickness, dense, irregular connective tissue. Heavy, coarse collagen fiber bundles that are extremely strong, and because they're oriented in every which way, they provide resistance to stretch in every direction. They also provide recoil because there's a considerable amount of elastic protein in the reticular dermis that, as you know, collagen resists stretch, but it does not recoil the way elastin does. So that's a cool thing about the dermis. Again, a lot of blood vessels in the dermis and the reticular dermis that are not there for nutrition purposes. They're there to allow us to dilate those vessels and bring a lot of extra blood near the surface to increase the gradient for heat radiation or heat removal from the body. In addition, there's so many blood vessels there that if you figure out the total volume of blood occupied in the skin at any moment in time, that represents a significant fraction of the total blood volume. Therefore, it is considered to be a blood reservoir. If we constrict those vessels, we can get that blood back into the remaining circulation if we need to. I have emphasized many times the sort of crisscrossing every direction arrangement of collagen fiber bundles in dense irregular connective tissue, but now I have to backpedal a little bit and admit that there is a certain amount of organization of the fibers in such a way that there's a grain, if you will, to the reticular dermis. So this diagram shows what are called cleavage lines. It's a map of cleavage lines in different parts of the body, and it just shows you where the majority of the collagen fiber bundles, if you could say so, are arranged in different parts of the body in the reticular dermis. It doesn't mean there aren't fibers running in every direction. It just means there is a sort of pattern of the majority of fibers running along these lines. And the reason to consider that is that if you injure the skin and it heals, scarring will typically take place, and the more of these collagen fiber bundles that are cut or damaged, the greater the scarring. And since we are very, very appearance-conscious social animals, we don't like scarring, and so if you're going to introduce a cut into the body for surgical purpose, for example, you will consult this cleavage line diagram to choose an orientation of your incision to cut the least number of collagen fiber bundles, increase the least amount of scarring. There's also an obvious feature of thick skin. If you look at the palms of your hands, you can see when you close your hand, you begin to see some wrinkles that form in the skin at very specific points. They're called flexure lines. So those are even deeper invaginations of the tissue that are designed to help the skin fold up neatly when you ask it to, when you close your hands into a fist and so forth. And here you can see flexure lines on the hand, around the joints and in the palm of the hand. Stretch marks are a source of a lot of discussion because, as I said, we are social animals that are very, very aware of our appearance, and changes in our appearance make us uncomfortable. It's just a survival adaptation, I believe, that we become very suspicious of changes in the appearance of the body, or suspicious of people whose body look different than ours. And anyway, strias are called stretch marks, stria. Stretch marks can be the result of increasing the dimensions of the skin. Forcing it to enlarge will usually produce some scarring for whatever reason. So when you have stretch marks, you'll see these red lines forming in the skin. Hormones can cause stretch marks. Cushing's syndrome is a disease in which or a condition of exposure to anti-inflammatory steroid medicines, and that results in some changes in the skin, among other things. Ehlers-Danlos syndrome is a genetic connective tissue abnormality that can lead to some changes in the skin as well as in other connective tissues. So, anyway, red stretch marks. Red stretch marks are thought to be the sort of earlier form when stretch marks first are formed, and they may progress to so-called white or silver stretch marks. You can treat such stretch marks by various strategies, ranging from chemical treatments with vitamin A derivatives to microdermabrasion, trying to trigger a wound healing mechanism that will sort of abrogate some of the scarring, activating melanocytes to fill in the white stretch marks there with some pigment to sort of hide them a little bit more. And here you can see some red stretch marks in this pretty dramatic looking example, and also some white stretch marks in the skin that are, again, those are a little more permanent, but they can be treated in some ways. It has even come to my attention that a popular cultural behavior has become in some quarters to tattoo these stretch marks, to actually draw attention to them and create a decorative pattern out of the stretch marks that occur in the body with, necessarily after experiences like pregnancy. Another thing that can happen to the skin if you apply some repetitive insults, mechanical insults to the skin, you may tear the layers of the epidermis, or tear the epidermis from the papillary dermis. And once that happens, fluid that's no longer being stopped from infiltrating the area will start to fill up and form pockets called blisters. So that can also result from ultraviolet light injury to the skin, or any kind of heat insult burns. The hypodermis is what we call the tissue that lies underneath the reticular dermis, and it's mostly adipose tissue and essentially areolar connective tissue that anchors the skin to the tissues below. Loosely, I might add, it anchors it to the tissue below. The hypodermis, the adipose tissue, is an important shock absorber. When you bump into things, you don't bruise the bones and muscles underneath because the adipose tissue is very good at absorbing those shocks. It is an important insulation. It's found entirely under the entire surface area of the skin organ, and helps trap the heat within our bodies. If we bring some hot blood superficial to the hypodermis, that's when we can dissipate more heat, and that's the purpose of those blood vessels in the dermis that we talked about. So just to summarize, the dermis and hypodermis absorb shock. They represent the strength, the mechanical strength of the skin, because of all the collagen fiber bundles. Feed the epidermis, areolar connective tissue. There's immune cells, white blood cells, that provide a defensive function, since the surface of the body is the site of many, many microbes that may penetrate the body and cause infection. Regulation of body temperature, vasodilation of blood vessels in the dermis, blood volume reservoir. Adipose tissue, fatty acids are a wonderful source of energy for cell metabolism. And vitamin D synthesis, we may have mentioned in part 1, but the first committed step, chemical change that occurs in the process of vitamin D synthesis occurs in the skin using the energy from ultraviolet light. So cholesterol molecules will be modified using UV energy, and then the product of that reaction will then be sent to the kidneys to produce the active form of vitamin D, which is needed to absorb calcium from your diet in your intestines. So you need vitamin D to maintain good bone density. Pigments, what makes the skin have its color? Melanin is the primary pigment of skin. It's produced by cells in the basal layer of the epidermis called melanocytes, and they produce vesicles filled with melanin and then package it up and send it out to the keratinocytes in their vicinity, and that creates a layer of pigmented cells that can absorb the ultraviolet light and protect the chromosomes of the dividing cells in the basal layer of the epidermis. So that's a very important role of melanin, and the more the better. There's most melanin is eumelanin. It's a brown color, and there is another type of melanin called pheomelanin, which is more of a reddish yellow color. So the appearance of the skin, in terms of pigmentation, results from differences in the amount of melanocytes, and therefore the amount of melanin that's produced, and usually different amounts of eumelanin. Occasionally, some people have almost exclusively pheomelanin. Freckles and pigmented moles are just accumulations of melanin in some parts of in little patches in the body, perfectly normal. Keratin or carotenoids are chemicals that come from plants that we take in our diet, and they travel in the bloodstream and accumulate in the skin, orangish yellow pigments. It turns out that they are good antioxidants, so they have a particular value in absorbing reactive oxygen species, just some toxic substances produced by normal metabolism or by exposure to stressors in the skin, and so they will help prevent damage to the cells by things like ultraviolet radiation that causes ROS formation. Hemoglobin. People with lighter skin, I don't know if fair skin is really a very good use of the term. I think we're talking about lighter skin here. Lighter skin means less melanin, and it means that the hemoglobin is more visible. Interesting, the skin is fairly transparent like most tissues of the body, unless they have some pigment added, so you can see the relative amount of blood flowing in the dermis of the skin from the surface oftentimes. So if someone has been exercising, you can often tell that they look quote-unquote red, or if someone is feeling unwell, or they're dehydrated, or they have lost some blood, they may look pallorous, meaning that there's been vasoconstriction happening and the blood has been sort of removed from the skin, and they look different. Other causes of alteration of the skin that may be correlated with certain diseases. Cyanosis is the condition in which the skin looks blue. You see children that are too cold and they're in the pool for hours and hours because they're having so much fun they will not get out. They may start to have hypothermia and become cyanotic, or people with heart disease and they can't oxygenate their blood adequately and deliver sufficient blood flow for their tissues, and you begin to see the deoxyhemoglobin in their blood makes them look blue. It's called cyanosis. Erythema. This could also result from lung disease, not just heart disease. Erythema means redness. So if you have inflammation, the skin is going to look red, or if you've just been exercising. Sunburn, if there's actual tissue injury, will cause erythema. That's sort of the minimal, the standard for the minimal amount of exposure that causes injury to the skin when you see that redness. Inflammation, though, if you have something that triggers mast cells to release histamine, there will be vasodilation. You'll see redness in the vicinity. Pallor, as I mentioned, is the appearance of skin when there's vasoconstriction happening. Anemia, not enough hemoglobin in the blood, so therefore there's a lighter color of the skin because not as much hemoglobin is flowing through. Vasoconstriction can cause pallor. Activation of the sympathetic nervous system initially before exercise leads to the need to dissipate extra heat from the body, or anger, other things that activate the sympathetic nervous system causes vasoconstriction in the skin, and that causes, again, pallor. You look as though you've seen a ghost, is what some light-skinned people have been known to say to each other when they are clearly have an unusual amount of vasoconstriction. Jaundice is a yellow appearance of the skin and the whites of the eyes that results from an actual yellow pigment being in the blood that shouldn't be present. That's a product of red blood cell recycling. So hemoglobin recycling involves a step in which macrophages convert the red hemoglobin to yellow-green bilirubin, and the bilirubin is usually very avidly scavenged up from the blood by the liver and then gotten rid of in the feces in the form of bile. Bile has the pigmented material. But if the liver is diseased, then the bilirubin remains in the blood, and there's a very obvious change in color. Bronzing of the skin can also result from Addison's disease, when the adrenal glands, the source of a lot of the steroid hormones, cholesterol-based lipid-soluble hormones in the body, and for some reason that causes a darkening of the skin. And finally, bruising. I'm sure everyone's familiar with that. If you have a trauma to your body and some blood vessels are broken underneath the skin, blood will leak out and it'll color the skin because, again, it's transparency, and all that blood, all that hemoglobin escaping from the blood vessels under the skin, you will see the black and blue marks that are present, which eventually will turn to yellow-green as the fibroblasts come in to repair the tissue and repair the bleed and convert the hemoglobin over to bilirubin, just like we were talking about in the case of jaundice. So that's why the bruises will turn color as they begin to dissipate and resolve. What about the effects of ultraviolet light on the skin? Ultraviolet light is a bad news energy source in the environment. When you go outside in the sun and there's a lot of ultraviolet light shining down, you get the direct rays of the sun, you could easily get skin cancer if you have skin that has a minimal amount of melanin. People with the lighter the skin, the more susceptible you are to skin cancer, because UV light is the carcinogen of skin, the thing that causes transformation or changes in the normal cells into tumor cells. Skin cancer is the most common by far of all the human cancers. Luckily, they're fairly accessible for treatment, so they're not usually considered an inducement of panic, but still the amount of money that's spent annually on treatment of skin cancers is pretty staggering. It turns out that UV light actually causes DNA mutations. That's the main mechanism of transformation of keratinocytes and melanocytes in the epidermis. Also, UV light, though, activates fibroblasts. That just means that fibroblasts, like you, can be in their sort of resting, happy state, just going through their day, taking things as they come, making some collagen, so forth. But if you expose them to UV light, they become angry and they become activated. They start releasing proteases, which are enzymes that will degrade the collagen and elastin fibers in the dermis, and the collagen can be repaired, but the elastic fibers are not replaced, and it causes permanent changes in the dermis of the skin. The skin starts becoming leathery and saggy. It no longer will recoil and stretch. UV light also destroys folic acid, and there's some concern that folic acid, being an important vitamin for our cell division, reduction of folic acid in the presence of a lot of UV light may actually compromise the available folic acid for developing embryos, which was obviously very bad. Photosensitivity, certain drugs cause, and wound healing conditions cause photosensitivity, meaning the skin is more responsive to the insults of different wavelengths of light. So your doctor will probably tell you, if you're taking certain antibiotics, for example, stay out of the sun during the course of this treatment. One of the appendages of the skin that we should talk briefly about is hair. The hair follicles, the little factories that produce the hairs that you're used to seeing emanating from your skin. And hairs are made out of dead keratinocytes. The stalk of many layers of dead keratinocytes packed with a harder type of keratin than what you find in the epidermis and the cornified layers. So this is a different keratin genes produce different keratin proteins that, when they assemble into the final cytoskeletal structure. As these cells die, it's harder and stiffer. Hence, we have the very durable hair follicles. So hair follicles are distributed throughout your body except on a few places like your palms and soles, your lips, your nipples, and parts of your external genitalia have no hair follicles. There's some certain functions of the hair on our skin, although they're not something to take too much to heart. Obviously, animals in many cases depend entirely on their hair for survival in the environment in which they live. We have all kinds of alternative strategies for surviving other than our hair, so we don't really say, well, we really need to protect ourselves from heat loss. Well, we can create our own shields from heat loss in the form of various garments, so whatever. So, hairs, again, are strands of dead flexible keratinocytes. They're produced by the hair follicles, which we'll take a look at in a second. The hair shaft is the part of the hair that extends above the skin surface, whereas the root is the part that lies down in the dermis. The hair bulb, as we'll see in a second, is the location where the hair shaft is forming, the root of the hair is forming, and there's some dividing cells down there, and so forth. If you look at a hair shaft in cross-section, you'll see that it has an inner medulla with maybe some pattern of pigmenting, and then an outer cortex, and those are terms that are often used in anatomy to describe the inner versus outer parts of an organ or a structure. So, very common use of terms. Inner medulla and outer cortex of the hair shaft. And then there's an outer layer of cells called the cuticle. And the cuticle is interesting because it produces a very characteristic pattern or texture to the surface of a human hair, which is very, very distinct from the hairs on any animal, and that has forensic value in distinguishing instantly human hairs from hairs of various mammals. The pigment in hair, it comes from the same melanocytes that produce the pigment in the basal layer of the epidermis. So as we'll see, the hair matrix, where the dividing cells are producing all the keratinocytes that produce a hair shaft, also contain melanocytes that produce the melanin. So again, eumelanin produces brown pigments in the hair. Pheomelanin produces reddish-orange pigments in the hair. With age, for some reason, oxidative stress in the hair matrix eventually leads to the demise of the melanocytes, and the hair loses its pigment, and we have gray and white hair. Just figure out how you can block that from happening and retain the healthy melanocyte populations in the hair matrix, and you'll be the richest person in the history of man. So there's a little picture cartoon of the cross section of a hair. Here's the hair shaft as it's about to emerge from the body, and you can see that surrounding the hair shaft is a so-called hair sheath or root sheath. There's an outer part of it that arises from cells of the dermis, from the connective tissue, and then there's an inner part of the root sheath that arises from the epidermis, from the keratinocytes. So again, the largest part of the follicle is sort of derived from epidermis, including this inner root sheath, external inner root sheath. So let's take a look at a cartoon of the hair follicle. I think will serve us well so that we can see what we're talking about when we discuss the various structures here. Here is a cartoon of the hair bulb, and there's an actual micrograph of a hair bulb. So we can see the inner part here is what is going to become the hair shaft. That is all the keratinocytes that will eventually, again, be packed with keratin filaments and die and produce the hair shaft. And we can see the epithelial root sheath, and then we can see the peripheral parts that are made up of a dense packing of fibroblasts and collagen fibers and so forth. The hair matrix, right up here in this little inner part of the bulb, where it invaginates, is where the growing cells are. So cell division is happening there, just like in the basal epidermis. There's stem cells in there, transit amplifying cells in there, and melanocytes. And so as this whole row of cells continues to divide and form all the cells of the hair shaft, we can pigment, that whole thing will become pigmented depending on the density and type of melanocytes that are present in the matrix. The dermal papilla, the hair papilla, I should say, is a specialized structure of the dermis in which there's a lot of capillaries that can feed this really, really aggressively mitotic hair matrix. So a lot of cells are dividing in there all the time. That takes a lot of energy. And so we have this hair papilla, the place where all that nutrition comes from. Different types of hair. Have you ever heard the term peach fuzz? Ultra fine, soft hair. That's called vellus hair. It's hair that's found in children before their sex steroid hormones begin to enter the bloodstream. Many females have this very fine vellus hair on most of their body surface. Terminal hair, coarse, longer hair on the scalp, that's what we call it, and the eyebrows. It also begins to grow in the axillary and pubic regions during puberty, but it's slightly different hair. It's a flattened kind of a hair shaft that makes it buckle and curl. Hormones and the state of nutrition greatly affect hair growth. If you don't have enough amino acids, protein in your diet, and to produce all these cells and produce all that keratin, you're going to have an impact on the hair, and the hair is going to thin. The hair follicles, interestingly, have a life cycle. Hair follicles do not just continue to grow and produce hair indefinitely, or your hair would go right down to the floor. What happens is the hair shifts between growth phases and dormant phases on a cyclical basis, and so the hair grows for a certain period of time, and so the hair length that you produce is sort of set by your own genetics, and then eventually that hair follicle just stops growing, and the majority of the hair bulb just dies back and withers. The hair falls out, and the follicle remains dormant for a period of time until, for reasons that are not well understood, it suddenly recapitulates itself, goes back into that nice hair bulb factory, and starts producing a new hair. The things that affect hair growth include sex steroids, and if in women male sex hormones are produced in unusually large amounts, such as by the adrenal glands produce a certain amount of androgens, male sex steroid-like hormones, in the female, but only in very, very small amounts. But if something happens in which the adrenal gland, either by way of a tumor or just an overzealous production of these androgens by the adrenal cortex, more hair will grow on the body, just as it would in a man. It's called hirsutism. And other signs of masculinization may occur. Alopecia is a special term meaning the loss of hair, and it's used in various different ways. It's not used the same way in all instances, so just to warn you about that. But alopecia just means hair loss, and the hair tends to thin in both sections with age. But in men, certain men that have a genetic predisposition, the hair on the scalp falls out sometime during middle age, or sometimes even during early, maybe in the 30s. And some people, anyway, they develop male pattern baldness, and you can see this shiny pate or crown where there's no hair growing. It's a response of some people's hair follicles to testosterone hormone. Those people's follicles have receptors for testosterone that cause the hair follicles to permanently enter into the dormant phase and no longer produce any more hairs. Alopecia areata is a specific true baldness condition that results from an autoimmune attack on the follicles. It's an autoimmune disease, and it can cause all of the hairs in the entire body to fall out. It's very demoralizing because, again, we place so much emphasis on our appearance, and we associate the wellness of someone and the health of someone and the normalcy of someone by where they look, and if their hair all falls out, that's considered quite a severe detriment. Other things that can cause loss of hair: stress. Severe stress or emotional trauma can cause hair to fall right out. Surgery, treatment with drugs that block cancer cell division, chemotherapies we often call them, but that just means any drug treatment technically. But when we treat steroids or treat cancers, we try to block the wild cell division in the tumor. We may also block the division of cells in the hair matrix, and the hair will fall out. Surgeries, acute high fever, protein deficient diet, malnutrition will surely cause hair loss and hair thinning. There's not enough amino acids available for the cells to produce to divide and produce the hair. If you have scarring, oftentimes scars, when scar tissue forms, when the epidermis repairs itself and the dermis repairs itself, there are no hair follicles in that newly forming tissue, in the scar tissue. So that's our story about the dermis and the hypodermis. Next time, we'll move on and talk about skin cancers and a few other aspects of skin that we should wrap up. So join me next time for part 3, for a discussion of the integumentary system.